Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL week number 7 overview and analysis video. We are really getting towards the end of the regular season here in the NACL. Things are really starting to ramp up in terms of the standings and in terms of where these teams end up, finalizing, whether they are qualifying for playoffs this week, which a lot of teams will be able to do, qualify for top 8, or alternatively, whether they are going to kind of qualify for the promotion tournament, which we will definitely see towards the end of the video. There is a lot on the line for a lot of these teams. The upper and lower echelons of the standings are definitely starting to materialize. So definitely interested in some of the matchups this week, but I'm excited to go over them. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the NACL up until this point, check out the playlist up in the iCard. That's every single week of the NACL done in the exact same format as what we are going to do in today's video. So again, check that out if you are interested. But of course, today what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover. And at the end of the video, of course, we will also be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10, talking about what teams I think are moving up, what teams are moving down. In the NACL in particular, it's much more, okay, how confident do I feel about a team's floor versus how high do I think a team's ceiling is, especially for the upper echelon of teams, because quite frankly, it's a top 6 and all of them can beat everyone at this point. Like, Dragonsteel definitely feels like a strong number 1, but outside of that, like, it is all good teams. It is all interesting teams. And so, don't take the power rankings so seriously as like, this is clearly who's better than the other. I think almost anyone can beat anyone on any given day, and we'll have to see if that ends up being the case further along this week. I'm excited to go over it. I hope you guys are as well, but I don't want to waste too much time at the beginning of this video. Let's jump right into the analysis, and of course, that starts with day number 1. And honestly, we got my personal match of the week right here on day number 1. This is a really telling series for me when it comes to my power rankings. It's Team Liquid Challengers taking on Fear x Starforge, and Fear picking up a gigantic victory here, not only winning the series, but winning it 2-0 and winning both games in pretty ginormous fashion, quite frankly. Like a really, really telling series here from Fear to show that them being number 2 in the standings, that's not a fluke, that's not an accident. They are one of the best teams in the NACL right now, and they continue to prove that. They are a true finals contender and a true championship contender at the current moment. For Team Liquid, this is obviously a pretty frustrating loss. This actually puts you down to 500. That's really not where this team wants to be. 4-4 is almost certainly not what they were looking for after the first couple weeks of action, but unfortunately it is where they are going to land. Games 1 and 2, kind of a tale of two different stories. Game 1, a huge comeback from Fear x Starforge, them being resilient, understanding where they needed to get their advantages in front-to-back 5v5s, understanding you have Brand, you have Corky, you have Aphelios. It doesn't really matter that you're down a ton of gold. You're always going to have the potential to be able to win fights in the back half of games, and then XU basically never missing a 50-50 smite, looking incredible in terms of his objective control, and Ablaze Olive really popping off in terms of the team fight. Some great ultimates from Instinct as well. And then game number 2, kind of the opposite story, very much a dominant performance from Fear, where they're really able to control the game from start to finish and just kind of bulldoze over Team Liquid. They were giving over some resources, but for the most part, they controlled everything on the map. Their draft was unbelievably good, and they executed on it well, and you just have to look at this team as one that can win in a variety of different ways, and that's what makes them very scary to have to run into. Player of the series is once again going to go to Ablaze Olive. He has genuinely been unbelievable over the past couple of weeks. Like, one of, if not the best player in the NACL over the past couple of weeks. He is certainly going to be in that MVP conversation, and he has started to really earn it with the performances that he's put out. I'm not going to try to sit here and say this is like a 1v9 kind of thing, because everybody on Fear played well. That's not the narrative that I want to try to push, but I do want to say that Ablaze Olive makes these games a lot easier for Fear to be able to execute on, because he is such a practiced and clean team fighter. It really does make things easier to execute when you know that Corky is going to be doing the maximum amount of damage in a lot of these fights, when you know that the Zeri is not only going to be able to, be really relevant in the mid to late game, but also actually do really well early on it, moving to skirmishes, playing alongside the Ivern and the Nautilus. It just makes things so much simpler for Fear to be able to play out these games when the middle of the map is so reliable, and that's what ABO has been for this team. So another really great series from him. I also want to give a big shout out to XU, who was excellent once again in this series. I think he has been really good across this split so far. Not that that should be a surprise. XU's a really good player, and he has been at the tier 2 level for a long time. I think his LCS stint obviously gets a bad rap. I don't think he deserves it. I think for the most part he was generally fine, and he showed a lot of upside. Nobody's going to be perfect in their first big stint in the LCS, especially playing with the team that he was playing with, but Again, I still think he gets way more hate than maybe he deserves. He is the perfect objective controller. This guy cannot miss a 50-50 smite. Philip was really good, especially in game number 2, just so aggressive on the jacks, really fun to watch. Instinct and Winsome, I thought had a really good series. A couple of great ultimates from Instinct in both of these games, on the Aphelios and on the MF. Really fun to watch there. Just an overall, generally very clean performance and very well-rounded performance from Fear, not only in the comeback in game 1, but just controlling everything in game 2. This is the exact kind of win you wanted to see to really cement themselves at the top of the standings. And then for Team Liquid, obviously this is a team that I've really believed in over the course of this split. I've consistently had them in my top 3. I've considered putting them into my top 2 for a lot of this split, but this was not all that encouraging of a performance. You got to be able to close out game number 1. You were, doing a good job of getting early leads. You just couldn't actually do anything with them. I think there was a lot of flipping going on. Your team fighting wasn't as clean. Your objective control wasn't as clean. It's kind of the flip side of what we just talked about, obviously, for Fear. But more than that, I think there was just a lack of communication and like a bad sense of urgency, I will say, in some of these games. Some engages that were just way too fast and way too over-aggressive, not being on the same page as the rest of the team. And I think a lot of that, unfortunately for me, comes on to Roamer in the mid lane, who's going to get my dud of the series here. Honestly, I was such a huge fan of Roamer in the LCK Challengers League. As you guys know, I watch that league regularly, and Roamer was the player, instead of Quad, quite frankly, that, was coming over this year that I was really excited about from the tape that I saw, because it really felt like he could be a difference maker mechanically at this level. Quad obviously ended up being a bit better. Not only is he on generally a more well-rounded team, but I think that he was just a better player, and we definitely saw that. But Roamer has been a bit disappointing to me. I know that feels like a weird thing to say because he has such good performances when he's winning, but the consistency is just not there. Not only is he not on the same page as everybody else on Team Liquid, which is becoming more and more clear when they play top-tier teams, especially in the late game. He's going in on his own way before the rest of the team is able to follow up. Specifically, him and Kim Down do not really seem to be on the same page in terms of when they want to fight, but he's not even dominating lane in the way that I just expected. I thought he was going to come into the NACL and kind of be what Eminus was when he came in and just mechanically dominate everybody. Kind of what Quad ended up being, right? It's not what Roamer has been. Blaze Olive was simply just better in the 1v1 and out of the 1v1 in this series. And if Roamer's not going to be a top 1 or 2 mid laner in the NACL, that's a bit of a disappointment considering what the expectations were. So I don't think he's a bad player, but I'm just concerned that he's not blowing me away like I expected him to. The rest of this team I think is generally fine. Jenkins has been so aggressive this split. I think for the most part it's been a positive, but sometimes it ends up being a negative, like in game 1 on the Kennen, getting caught out just a little bit too much. I still think Keel has been excellent across this split, one of the best junglers in the league, and certainly one of the most consistent. I still want to see him on his comfort picks a bit more, but he has gotten so much better on things like Sejuani that it really isn't that big of a problem. And Spawn and Kim Down kind of did their own thing. They are generally, the quote-unquote weak side of this team. Ezreal, Kai'Sa, they're playing for late game. It's kind of what they've done all split long. But Team Liquid's fine. I'm not going to freak out about this team. I just wish that they won a game. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're no longer going to be a contender for top 2 or top 3. I still think this team has the potential to do that, but Fear has very much taken the optimism that I had for Team Liquid for themselves, and that's a huge thing for Fear overall. Hopefully they can keep up this momentum. But then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and yeah, this is the upset I was excited to talk about. It's FlyQuest Challengers taking on Blue Otter, and Blue Otter, fighting for their lives at the current moment, is able to pick up their biggest win at the NACL level. This is, unquestionably massive for Blue Otter. It's amazing for them to be able to get this. This does keep them alive in terms of the standings. They needed this win. It would have been an absolute disaster if they dropped this series, and they should have dropped this series. Not in terms of gameplay. They played great in both games 2 and 3. I think they did a great job of, understanding that FlyQuest might be able to just win early because they're a team full of, players that mechanically speaking are some of the best in the entire region, but as long as they keep their cool, if they draft some pretty easy to execute comps, specifically game number 3, which we will talk about. I love the draft for Blue Otter in game 3. It's so easy to execute that it just makes it so much easier for FlyQuest to mess up, but if you just draft easy to execute comps, and if you, give over resources early, if you just stop the bleeding, you don't try to, compete and, destroy 1v1 these players that might be able to generate large advantages against you. If you just say, okay, we'll accept that we're going to go down a bit in lane, but we are going to execute better in the later half of the game, all of a sudden, it becomes a lot easier to win some of these fights, and that's exactly what Blue Otter was able to do in the second and third games of this series. Player of the series was honestly so tough for me, and it's for a good reason. It's because 2 players on this team I thought were unbelievably important and good for Blue Water. I ended up giving it to Levitate down in the bot lane because he really was the one to execute on a lot of the setup. Quacker more than deserves player of the series here. He was unbelievably good for Blue Water. That Olaf game was dominant in game number 2. The ultimates and just the general setup that he was able to do in game 3 on the Wukong were unbelievably good. He was always in the right position. Trust me, we'll get to Quacker. He was really excellent in this series, but Levitate, it's just so hard to not praise him for, staying cool, calm, and collected, and, generally understanding the assignment, if you will, on Zeri and on Kai'Sa, understanding that you're going into Jinx and you're going into Varus, and you might not always have pressure early on, especially because Chime in particular is such a good laner. Not that Sajed isn't, just that, Chime is really oppressive to play into 2v2. Levitate, Rovex, they understood, hey, let's get into the mid game, and then we can genuinely just blow stuff up. The Kai'Sa game in particular in game 3, unbelievable. Levitate has actually been super good for Blue Water over the course of this split. There's been a lot of up and down from a couple of other players on this team. Topside in particular, I've definitely talked about being very feast or famine for Blue Water, but Levitate has very much held down the fort down in the bot lane, and it was really fun to watch. Rovex was also very good on the Alistair. Somehow, someway, he had that global taunt on him at all times where, FlyQuest just wanted to put all of their damage into the ulting Alistair, and, he soaked up a lot of the CC, a lot of the damage, allowed that Kai'Sa, allowed the Wukong to really do a lot of the heavy lifting in some of the later fights. But again, Quacker deserves a big shout out as well. That Olaf game in game 2 was really oppressive to play into. He could not be stopped. Like, there was nothing that Fly was going to do to be able to shut him down, and again, the Wukong ultimates were genuinely terrific as well. But again, I love this Game 3 draft. I know some people are going to look at this and say, well, Wukong top, Hecarim, Vex, very straightforward of what they want to do. That's exactly why I love it. You're at the NACL level. FlyQuest is, going for this little more, execution-oriented comp here with the LeBlanc and the Varus and the Aatrox. Like, you do have to do a bit more in the mid to late game to, get the full potential out of some of these champions, the Viego in particular. But for Blue, it's like if somebody lands an engage tool, you can CC chain into Oblivion. You have everybody follow up. You have Kai'Sa diving in, Vex diving in, Wukong, Hecarim, Alistair, all of them can dive in at any given time, and it just makes getting a catch if you find one person out of position so much easier. It makes it so much easier to end up playing the game. I love this draft for Blue Otter, and I really do think it ended up working super well. So, Levitate, Quacker, definitely standouts. Rovex was also very good. Music, I thought, was pretty good in this series. Samikin had some good and some bad moments. Wasn't a huge fan of his game number 1 on the Taliyah. Always gonna love the Vex pick. I've talked about that as a Vex player myself. It's always good to see Vex actually win at the pro level. I don't think the Vex was particularly important towards the comp in general, but I think Samikin has done more than enough of the heavy lifting over the course of this split up until this point where, for Quacker and Levitate to be the ones to step up. I think that's totally fine for Blue Water. I'm just really impressed with this win. I never in a million years thought they were going to be walking out of this series 2-5, but here we are. This is massive to keep Blue's hopes alive. And then for FlyQuest challengers, obviously this is a frustrating loss, and they've had quite a few of these over the course of this split. They've now lost to Winthrop, they've lost to Blue Water. This is not the FlyQuest that was untouchable from last split. This is not the defending champions that you would remember, and I don't think it's all just because Quad is gone. Now, I do think it has a factor to play in this. Bradley is not Quad in terms of dominating the early laning phase, although he looked like it in game number 1 on the Tristana, which was a great performance, and generally, I thought Bradley was the best player on FlyQuest in this series, but the rest of this team has really started to become a little bit more lax in the late game. I don't really understand what the idea was in the back half of these games. It really felt like they were discoordinated. They were targeting the wrong people. It just felt very weird. It didn't feel very clinical from a team that is traditionally known for being pretty clinical in the late game. Shaden is actually going to get my dud of the series. The Sejuani in game 2, don't really know what happened there. The Viego never really was able to get online in game number 3. I know Shaden wasn't exactly noticeably horrible, but he was relied upon a lot in both of these comps to be someone that could potentially pull the trigger on some big fights, or, in game 3, capitalize on the trigger when it's pulled in these fights, and he just wasn't there. Music was definitely more relevant, but more specifically, Quacker and Levitate and Rovex completely just took him out of the series, and I know Shaden has been kind of a topic for conversation because he is a bit up and down, especially with someone like Tomio, who I think is a relatively similar player, not having a ton of success at the LCS level. It can be a bit of a concern, but this was definitely kind of a standout, not good series for me when it came to Shaden. I think everybody else was generally fine, but small mistakes, right? Chime and Sajed not focusing priority targets in the back half of the series. Small mistakes like that. Surdy not really being as relevant as he's been in other series. Even if he's able to win lane, he doesn't translate that into late game success nearly as well as Quacker, who was down in CS in both games 2 and 3. Like I said, Bradley was pretty good. I'm certainly not going to complain about him in this series. He was the only player for FlyQuest that I thought was doing anything consistent at all, but this is not not like the dominating series from one of the top teams that you would expect, I have continued to stand my ground and keep them in the top 2 in terms of my power rankings. I don't know how much longer I can do that if they're going to have these weird series like this. I expect them to be able to clean things up, especially going into playoffs. This is certainly not a team that I want to count out, but there are real question marks about this team, more so than just, oh, well, it's a midseason slump. And then for Blue Otter, again, I can't oversell how ginormous this is for their hopes of staying up and not having to go down into that promotion tournament. For them to be able to get into the top 8, they need wins like this. They have to be able to pick up wins in series like this. This is genuinely ginormous, but it doesn't end here. You have to be able to keep this momentum. But if you can beat FlyQuest, you can probably beat a lot of teams here in the NACL. And then moving on now to day number 2, and it's another very intriguing matchup. Two teams really trying to establish positioning here for seeding in the playoffs. It's Supernova taking on Disguised. And Supernova picks up a very important 2-0 series win, not only because it really puts them in a much better position, but more specifically for DSG because, as we'll talk about later on in this segment, they might not be finishing super hot to this split. There are some roster changes incoming because of LCS roster changes, one of their players getting, I guess, called up, quote-unquote promoted to the LCS that I think will end up really kind of harming DSG's chances moving down the stretch. This should be kind of the last series with the strongest version of this team, and, you know, for them to go out, 0-2 in it, it's not really all that encouraging for, DSG moving forward after already being a relatively flippy team. So we'll go ahead and talk about it, but we'll start with Supernova, of course, as we do here with the winning team. Player of the series, again, kind of a tough decision, and again, it's between the AD carry and the top laner, who both played unbelievable. Lens, Faisal, both of them were very good in this series. I think it's just all up to which game you take more importance in, which game you thought was more dominant. I think Lens on the Kalista in game 2 was a pretty easy choice for me. He's going to get player of the series, was excellent on the Kalista. This has always been kind of a signature pick. When you go back to his days on Wildcard, this was always the one that he was really successful on. Even last split on Fear, he was doing some really good things on Kalista. This is the champion I most associate with him individually as a player, and Tomo and Poom have been the strength, or Tomo in particular has been the strength of DSG. They definitely tried to play towards him in this series, especially on the Jhin. In game number 2, it just didn't end up mattering. Lens was better in the early game. He was able to counter a lot of the aggression shown by DSG, and he ended up getting super fed in that second game on the Kalista, just completely making every fight so much easier for Supernova. So credit to Lens. He's a player that I'm not going to say I've criticized in the past, but I haven't exactly been enthused about calling him like the best AD carry in the NACL, and I think he's actually having a phenomenal split so far. He's been really active for Supernova. Diamond has obviously helped that a lot. Diamond was very noticeable in game number 1 on the Seraphine. That pick actually really worked. Not that I'm surprised, but this is a bit of a takeaway, I would say, from DSG. Poom, kind of someone who has played some Seraphine in the past, and so Diamond being able to pick it up here, he looked really good on it. They had the Wombo combo really down in game number 1 with the Seraphine ult into MF ult, Rumble ult on top of that. There's a lot of things that you can do if you have that lockup, that charm for a couple of seconds, and Diamond I thought was super proactive, so definitely want to give him a shout out. But of course, how can I talk about game 1 without talking about Faisal, who continues to have a terrific split? I think he is clearly the best player on Supernova right now. He is the driving force for what they want to do in the mid to late game, and he's certainly been the most consistent. Tenacity is a good player. We saw that in game number 2 on the Jax, but Faisal is arguably just straight up better. Right now, the Rumble was unbelievable in game 1. He was still very good on the Gragas in game 2, but going deathless on Rumble in the game that existed in game 1, like the way that the game ended up working out, is truly an accomplishment. He was great. So Faisal, Lens, Diamond, I have to shout out Kenvi. His pathing this series was unbelievable. He has really embraced this idea of being kind of a secondary carry on this team. He was kind of their primary focal carry last split. He was somebody that I think they relied a lot on in the early game to set the tempo for them in spring. It has not been that. I mean, he's still obviously really good in that role, but he has become a lot more of someone that's willing to give over, resources. And, he's played this entire series essentially with the idea of, let's make sure that Lens and Faisal are in the best possible position to carry the game. So I thought Kenvi was genuinely terrific here. Toasty was very good as well. Supernova just looked very, very good here. And especially in, a league right now that is really up for debate. We talked about it. The top 6 are all so competitive. Like, wins like this are super important. Like Supernova just 2-0ing DSG. These are the kinds of wins you have to get in order to try to get one of those top 2, top 3 seeds going into playoffs, which could become more and more relevant. Again, top 2 seeds, that's kind of really where you want to land. There are going to be 2 teams, quote unquote, outside of the top 6 in the playoffs, and, depending on what happens with DSG, potentially 3, getting one of those top 2 seeds could be super important towards like actually getting there. So Supernova, in a pretty decent spot. Even getting that number 3 seed would be massive to potentially try and play play a team like DSG in round 1. But for DSG on the other side, again, I don't want to be super pessimistic about this team. I'm just really not all that enthralled by the overall team effort that they offer. I think that they have a couple of good performances, but I've really not been convinced by this team over the course of this split. I have kind of been a doubter, if you will, over the course of this split. Yukino is going to get yet another dud of the series for me. His pathing really cost DSG, just putting so much time and attention into lanes that weren't even really winning, like putting so much attention into Tomo on the Jhin in game number 2, only for Lens to get super fed because of the attention that Yukino put in, for all of his pathing to get completely countered by Kenvi and by the really good plays that the bot lane was making. That's really not ideal. He wasn't particularly effective in team fights. I've just really not been all that impressed with Yukino so far this split, especially because we had high expectations, or at least good expectations for him going into this split. They really haven't been met, at least for me so far. Tomo and Puma have been such a, figurehead point for DSG. They've been kind of the sun that the entire team revolves around, at least in my opinion. For most of this split, Tomo has been kind of the one to do a lot of the heavy lifting in late game fights. He is the player that's getting called up to LCS to replace Meech on 100 Thieves. That could be problematic for DSG, because first of all, you're putting him on Ornn in game number 1. I understand, like, Puma's put a lot of time and effort into playing Senna because he was playing with Manui last split, who loves to play Ornn and Seraphine and a lot of these, other supportive champions, and so I'm sure Puma is just more comfortable on Senna than he is on Ornn in terms of the practice. But putting Tomo on Ornn, who's kind of been somebody that I've considered your hard carry all year long, not really what I would do. And I like the idea of putting resources into the Jhin in game 2. It just really did not end up working out. That's a problem. Like, Young was fine here. Tenacity was super fed in game number 2. He should have been able to 1v9 in a lot of circumstances, but DSG just didn't play around the Jax as well as they needed to. And so you're now sitting here at 4-3, and I don't know if it gets better. Again, Tenacity, rumors are, and I believe this is confirmed at this point, Tenacity is role swapping down to bot lane. He will be the AD carry for the rest of this split. I've never seen him play ADC. I have no idea how he's going to do. Brandini coming back to pro play, coming out of the coaching position. He will take the top lane role. Brandini is a good player. He's been good at this level before. I don't know where he's at right now because I haven't seen him play in quite a while. He's coming essentially out of retirement for this, but I don't think things are getting better for DSG. This was kind of a must win for them in terms of confidence, and they did not get that. For Supernova, this is pretty huge. Really like the direction that they're going in. If Lens and Diamond in particular can be one of the scarier bot lanes, or at least one of the more consistent bot lanes, I really trust Faisal right now. I think Kenvi has really adapted to his role, and Toasty has been excellent all year long. Supernova can absolutely be one of the scarier teams, and that's just a sentence we're saying a lot about a lot of these top teams right now. And then moving on to our final series of the weekend here. It is our second series of day number 2, and another one that's super integral towards the seeding at the end of the year here. It's Winthrop University taking on CCG Esports, and CCG picking up a very big victory, moving themselves to 3-5, moving Winthrop to 3-5. It does seem to be some confusion about where these teams lie in terms of the standings, because, Cubby at the end of the series did say that CCG was now ahead of Winthrop. I'm not sure if that's because they beat them. I don't know what the tiebreaker rules are. They don't have a better game record, and so I would assume that they're still in 8th place because they'll be 7-13 at the end of this series. Winthrop will be 7-11 at the end of this series. Winthrop just has a better win-loss record, so again, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I don't technically know what the tiebreakers are here. I'm assuming that it's game score, but that would just be my assumption. Maybe it is head-to-head. Let me know again. But CCG continuing to look good and continuing to prove that I was probably right to have them at number 7 for the entirety of this split. They continue to be kind of the line for me, right? The bottom 3 are all decent teams that can all win on any given day, but CCG is kind of the difference maker between the top 6 that I think have all really locked themselves in, and, the bottom 4, they're kind of that, they should be beating a lot of the teams towards the bottom. So, I feel pretty good about having them at number 7, and honestly, I really like the way that their new recruit Kryra came in and played this series. He's going to get player of the series for me. This, again, was a super tough decision because a couple of players were unbelievably good for CCG. It feels like super disrespectful to not give this to Shochi in the mid lane, who was unbelievable for CCG in this series, but I really just wanted to give a big shout out to Kryra because, I talked about it last week. I gave him dud of the series for their loss last week, and it felt very bad because I actually thought he played generally fine. Just got caught up in not being as communicative with the rest of the team, clearly not as much on the same page. The practice element definitely came into play where it felt like other teams just had a little bit more cohesion than they did because he is new. This week it was kind of a complete turnaround, and so for me, the Zyra game in game 3 was more than enough for me to want to give him player of the series, and Quite frankly, there was a jungle canyon in the second half of this series. We'll talk about the Lillian game 1 for Winnie. It's the reason he's not getting dead of the series because he was excellent in game 1. Big draft gap, as we'll talk about in, just a second. But game 2, game 3, Kryra was unbelievable. Game 3 in particular, he just completely gapped Winnie, was everywhere on the map. The Zyra was super impactful and very necessary for this comp to work. And so, really happy to see him come in and, look good. I think we all expected him to be a pretty decent player for this team. I've seen a lot of really good things about him in terms of the expectations, and he really lived up to that here. But again, Shochi was awesome, pulling out his signature pick, or at least what I would consider his signature pick in the Akshan in game number 2. That's kind of the champion I think of when I think of Shochi, and he was awesome in game 2, just completely took over those fights with his damage. The Sivir in game 3, Sivir mid, with all these 80 carries in the mid lane, Sivir is absolutely one of the ones that would perform well, in terms of the context of being able to scale into the late game. So looks really good here. Obviously game 1, definitely a bit of a different story, but he was probably the biggest positive factor for CCG in game number 1. So I'm certainly not going to be a huge, negative factor. Shochi, if you want to give him player of the series, give it to him. He was genuinely phenomenal here. Want to give a big shout out to Manui and Trevor. Trevor has been awesome across this whole split. He has really regained that form that I was praising him for when he was on Fear. I remember, last year I was talking him up so much week to week. I was talking about him as a top 2, top 3 support in the NACL, somebody that I really wanted to see in the LCS, soon. Obviously, a lot of that hype ended up, I'm not going to say dying down, just he was on, worse teams moving forward, and support is often a role where if the rest of your team is losing, it's really hard to look good, and so, again, a lot of that hype ended up, moving down a little bit, but he's not even on, a superstar team right now, but he's constantly making play after play after play. For me, Trevor has been the best player on CCG, and that's not to take anything away from everybody else, but just play after play after play. Trevor is such a great playmaker, and when he gets to play with people that he does have good communication with, when he is on the same page as the rest of the team, which he clearly is with the Fear Boys here, with Shochi, with Manui, even with Kryra, they had very good synergy in this series. It's super fun to watch. That Alistair in game 2, the Nautilus in game 3, it's great. Manui looked excellent on the Jhin in game number 3. Obviously, game 1 got sniped out from that Seraphine. That was clearly the direction they wanted to head in with their comp, and, Winthrop was even able to see that and take that away, but outside of that, he was really good this series. The Jhin, like I said, in particular in game 3, dominant, and Crimson continues to be solid. Wasn't quite as perfect in this series as he's been at times in the past. I think he's really been, kind of a breakout star in the top lane for me, very similar to how I was talking about Quacker last year, where it's I didn't really know much about him going into the split. He has looked awesome, so that's really cool to see. I don't think he was, again, perfect. I think he ended up dying for the cause a lot here, but generally was not a negative at all either. So CCG looking good, and again, kind of feeling like the gatekeepers of the upper and lower parts of the NACL. I would expect this team to be a playoff team. We'll see, obviously, how things go over the back half of the season. 2 weeks remaining, and their schedule is not particularly easy, so we'll definitely see how it goes. They might have dug themselves too big of a hole, but at least for now, I feel pretty good about this team in terms of roster construction. And for Winthrop, this is more of what I expect from this team. Again, I think they've just been very overperforming over the course of this split up until this point, and that's not a negative. I want that to be interpreted as a good thing. I would so much rather a team over than underperform my expectations. We want teams at the NACL level to grow and evolve, but there are going to be some inconsistencies with that style if a team is, theoretically overperforming, and, we see that here where sometimes the plays just don't end up working out. Winnie was excellent in game 1, not very good down the stretch of this series. I think Skytech continues to be someone that I'm a bit concerned about. He's going to get dud of the series. I just don't think he's been particularly good over the course of this split. I really like how Aaron has been able to play. I think Denethor has shown some interesting things. Winnie is very hit or miss, but when he hits, he looks really good. Even Darkwings, again, somebody who's pretty hit or miss, but has been pretty decent across this split. Skytech has been a bit concerning in terms of his over-aggression. The set game, I just didn't like it in game 3. I don't like how he plays the Renata. I love Skytech, and I was praising him a lot during the CLOL Championships, and I've talked about him before when he was with Evil Geniuses on this channel, and he's somebody that I've praised in the past. It just hasn't necessarily come across to me as his best split ever, and especially when you're going across from someone like Trevor, who is making play after play on the other side down the stretch of this series, it's a little bit more noticeable for me. So Skytech is going to get dead of the series, but like I said, Winthrop is still in a pretty decent position. Sitting at 3-5, they're not in a bad spot by any means. If it is game score that ends up breaking the tie here, they should still be in 7th place, and 4 wins is likely enough to get a team into the playoffs regardless. I think it is kind of the line right now. If you get 4 wins, you're guaranteed locked in. Winthrop hasn't quite hit that threshold yet. Technically, things are still open for Winthrop, CCG, and Blue Water. One of those teams will end up missing the playoffs, and I think Winthrop feels pretty comfortable, but hopefully CCG can start feeling a bit more comfortable as well. Again, they've done their job against the teams that they're supposed to beat. They just haven't been, beating teams that are better than them, like Winthrop and like Blue Water have been able to do. If they would have done that, this race would have been over a long time ago, and so for CCG, they just got to keep the form. If they can, just survive and hopefully continue their presence like they were able to show in this series, that's going to be fine. And it definitely feels like this team has gotten better with Kryra coming in, but hopefully it's going to be enough, because it really is up to kind of the way that the rest of the teams end up falling, whether or not they control their own destiny. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 7 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen now, the updated standings. After 7 weeks of action, I have continued to sort these teams by game record. Again, if that's not the case, if that's not how they're going to be sorted going into playoffs, then please let me know. I just assume that that is the tiebreaker, and so that is what I am using in terms of my standings, but we'll see if that ends up being the case in terms of how people have talked about it online. But of course, no ties, at least in terms of game score at this moment. A lot of ties in terms of series score, so a lot still to be determined, but a lot of teams actually qualifying for the playoffs, which you can see with the little green outline. That is every single team on the left side here, as well as Team Liquid. All top 6 have qualified for playoffs. That means there are 2 playoff spots open for debate, and they are between 3 teams, because AOE, with everything that's transpired, has officially been, bottom 2'd. They are not going to be in the top 8 no matter what happens. They could win out and it wouldn't matter. They have officially been locked into the promotion tournament. Not that it's entirely unexpected. This team has yet to be able to win a series, even if they are Game 2 merchants and the best team in the entire league in Game number 2s. It's just very strange. But with all the roster changes that they've been going through, it's not entirely surprising. That means 3 spots open, 7, 8, and 9 for Winthrop, CCG, and Blue Otter. One of those teams will end up missing the playoffs. The other 2 will end up locking in. We can see who I predict to have that happen to in my power rankings, which you can see on the power rank column of all of these teams. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week. We can go over risers and fallers. It's really just the top of the standings that's going to change for me. Fear is going to jump up to number 2. I just can't deny it any longer. They are the second most consistent team in the NACL right now, only behind Dragonsteel, and they have proven that with their record. They're going to have a chance to prove that they might even deserve that number 1 spot next week with the top 2 teams finally going head-to-head. We'll see Dragonsteel and Fear, and I'm really excited to see who ends up coming out on top of that one, but we've got some changes, of course, to justify that. Fly is going to move down to number 3. I still can't completely give up on this team, even with their bad loss to Blue and with the inconsistencies that they've shown. I'm still not going to give up on this team being a contender, because it's just really hard for me to imagine that a team that's this talented, that was so good at playing around, multiple different facets of the game last split, is just going to completely implode with a new mid laner. I just don't believe it just yet. We'll see if, their playoff performances end up being very similar to this, but I have a feeling they might actually look better going into playoffs. And then similar thing for Team Liquid. They're going to fall to number 4. Not a great loss to Fear, but also this is an Oregon, a team that has, consistently overperformed, not only in the regular season, but specifically in the playoffs. They almost always finish top 3 or top 4, regardless of what happens in the regular season. And so it's very hard for me to imagine that this team is somehow different, when I've argued for most of this split that this is one of the more consistent versions of Team Liquid challengers that we've gotten in recent years. So those are the changes. Maybe Supernova can move up into the top 3. I think that's pretty realistic if that, continues to be a positive for them. DSG, we'll see what ends up happening to them. I'm worried about the roster changes, and so for now they're staying at number 6, but it's all going to be about the 3 teams kind of clustered there. CCG obviously staying at 7 because they beat Winthrop. No real reason to change that. This was kind of the telling series for me, but CCG definitely feels like the best of the rest, and Winthrop definitely has a bit of a head start on Blue Otter, which is why I still have Otter at number 9, towards the bottom of these standings. My projected team to get, that second promotion tournament spot and not in the playoffs. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comment section below. Love to know your thoughts and opinions on that. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 7. And player of the week, this one was pretty easy. It's going to go to Kryra. I just talked about it in the final series. He was super impressive in the back half there. Games 2 and 3 were probably 2 of my favorite games of the entire series. Game 3, just the Zyra was awesome. And he just completely rebounded after what I thought was maybe not the most spectacular debut last week. So Kryra was my choice for player of the week. Ablaze Olive, Lens, they are going to be my honorable mentions here. ABO has just been dominant over the last couple of weeks, probably the best player in the NACL in terms of performances over the past 2 or 3 weeks. We'll see if he can keep that up, because it has really kind of coincided with a big spike in performance from Fear, and that's kind of what's put them in the top 2 for me. And then Lens had that phenomenal game on Callista in his series, and it's just really hard to deny that. Faisal was someone I considered here. Shochi was someone I considered as a potential honorable mention. Even someone like Levitate I considered as an honorable mention. Quacker could have been in this conversation. There were a lot of players that I think played really well across this week. I think we got some pretty good good games out of some pretty good players, but those were the two I decided as my honorable mentions. Kryra is going to get my player of the week, though. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Skytech. It really was not impressed with the way he played out the back half of that series against CCG, and I think it really ended up costing Winthrop. Again, he's just been pretty inconsistent, and, in this meta where, as I've talked about in a lot of other regions, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades as a support, where you have to be able to win lane, you have to be able to roam, you have to be good in team fights. Like, you really have to have an all-around game with how the support is asked to play the game at the current moment. It just doesn't feel like Skytech is on the same page as a lot of the rest of this roster. It's not been the same kind of synergy that we saw in the CLOL championships. Hopefully he can start to get it together, but I just didn't really like the series this week, so he's going to get dud of the week, and Kryra is going to get my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week. Playoffs are starting in a lot of those regions. LEC and LPL are obviously done with their regular seasons. The LCK and the LCS are very quickly approaching, and the NACL is very quickly approaching the playoffs. And so if you're interested in playoff coverage or just general LoL coverage across the entire world, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all